Hey and welcome. Welcome back to Deep Noetics, to a tale of thought and techniques. It's been a while. I thought I'd restart the streams. I thought I'd get back into it. Been busy. Been busy in the past days. Been busy in the past weeks, which is why I couldn't really get back into it. But I've been doing a lot of studying. I've been doing a lot of reading. I managed to have the time to get through a lot of history, a lot of world history, a lot of Arnold Toynbee, but also John Darwin, After Tamerlane, great book. I've been really weaving together a lot of different approaches to history and the way global power functions and has functioned historically. I've also been getting into looking at different conspiratorial views, looking at the perspective of the influence of secret priesthoods, esoteric cults, and how this kind of hidden hand, the idea of the hidden hand controlling, pulling the strings behind the scenes, how that plays into our understanding of a lot of history. I've tried to weave together especially the famous four networks of power. So, if you look at Domhoff's work, looking at the four networks of power, William Domhoff for network theory, he speaks of the ideological, the economic, the military, and the economic systems of power, or networks of power. So in his case, these are networks of people. These are networks of different actors, of different individuals that align or do not align in their interests, and they have access to certain powerful positions due to these different networks that they belong to, and within these networks they can be part of highly connected nodes that are connected to a lot of other powerful people, or to less connected nodes. However, what is more interesting is if you take these four networks and regard them as systems in the system theoretical sense of Niklas Luhmann. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that we're not looking at individuals as the building blocks, you could say, of these systems, but rather these systems are in themselves so to say operationally closed, meaning that they do not directly enact upon each other. Whereas if you look at individuals, an individual of some kind of priestly ideological elite can easily be seen how he can cross over into an economic network. Speaking of individuals, it's in itself a social system. And their interactions with each other, for example, in country clubs and powerful institutions like the Bohemian Grove, or even something like the World Economic Forum, these are different sociological factors that play into the collaboration of powerful individuals. However, if you look at systems, then we have particular operations that indicate powerful decisions within a power system. So, for example, if you look at the economic system, you can look at something like capital, or just basically money, funds, debt. These kinds of tasks do not directly translate into other systems, right? So they are coupled, they are correlated. So, for example, there is a high correlation between money and military power, in the sense of that side that spends more on their military, that side that has more funding for their military, tends to be more powerful in the military sphere. However, it's not a direct operation. The economic system does not directly operate on the military system. So that means you can't, in every case, just throw money at a war in order to win it. For example, you have most famously the operation of the US Army in Afghanistan, Which obviously, if there had been a real ideological effort of the Americans to really conquer Afghanistan, they probably would have been capable to do so. However, in the context of that war, they were unmistakably the more wealthy, the better funded military. However, that still didn't translate into military power, and they had to retreat from that battlefield. You see similar developments now in Yemen with the Houthis. So what this basically means, there seems to be another variable, or there seems to be other variables determining military success. And you have a very basic one in the case of Afghanistan or Yemen, where the people that are on the other side of that conflict, they have more to lose. They have only that soil, they only have that land, they're tied to their locality. Whereas the United States, being an external force, they don't really have a military that is willing to die for that conflict, a military that is ready to leave, to give up their life for victory in that conflict. There's just not the same stakes at play here. And so even though there was a vast imbalance in terms of the funding, in terms of the economic power of one side in that war, it did not result in a direct translation of military power. So you have separate systems of power that are structurally coupled, meaning they're not completely disjointed and do not interact with each other whatsoever. However, they are not perfectly aligned either. Someone being rich is not synonymous with someone being powerful. And so you can see this, for example, with Elon Musk being more wealthy than Donald Trump, but yet technically not more powerful in terms of political power. So looking at history and studying the development of world history, I have been kind of taking this approach of first having a general historical approach or a general historical outlook, looking at the studies and the works of Arnold Toynbee, for example, who basically gave a general overview of the interaction of man and Mother Earth and the various ecological, economic, various climatological and other factors that played into the rise and fall of empires. And then I've kind of split it up into the various systems, looking at the ideological influences, the ideas, the cults, the missions, the great work that the priesthoods were engaged in. Then separately looking at the economic history, I can really recommend David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, as a kind of a world economic history. It's focused on the topic of debt, but I haven't really seen a work that goes so much into the depth of how the economies were structured across the world in different civilizations throughout history. And so I've been delving into world history in these various different systematic approaches, and now beginning to tie it back together. And I've been tying it back together by writing on different particular aspects of history and see how these different systems kind of influence each other, how they're intertwined, how there's a synergy between these systems that bring about certain historical dynamics. Anyone wants to read up on this, I've been getting more active on Substack. You can see most of my articles for free and read them and look at how I bring together these different systems of power. So one of my latest ones, called Priesthoods of Power, I get into the different paradigms of power that we've had throughout our early history. So I'm beginning really at the early rise of civilization in the river basins. So if we look at human history, we get this stereotype of the hunter-gatherer, which is just kind of an admission of a lack of knowledge that we have on those peoples of those ages. In the Upper Paleolithic or the early Paleolithic, and essentially our description of these phases derives from our lack of understanding of those phases, because most of human output does not leave a lasting artifact if it's not largely technological. So, for example, once humans started building megalithic structures, for example, huge temples, huge places of worship, those obviously were much more likely to remain and for us to discover them nowadays. Same thing with tools or particular locations like caves that were particularly apt at conserving certain kinds of cultural artifacts of early humans. However, most of humans that would have had a pretty vast, teeming diversity of cultural setups, cultural practices, you could call them strategies, stable strategies of human coordination, most of those will have been lost in history until we have the rise of these early river basin societies, as they did leave us with larger structures that they constructed. Structures of temples, of towns, of places of worship, strongholds, walls. And specifically, most commonly, people speak of the early civilizations around the Nile, the Euphrates and Tigris river basins, but also the Indus Valley basin and the Yangtze Yellow River basin in China. So, fascinatingly enough, we have the rise of civilizations that in certain ways have remained until this day. So, major centers of civilization and of power have until very recently also been the Middle East, the Mesopotamian area, Mesopotamian basin, as well as India and China. Only Europe, one could say, Western Europe, is a relatively new, relatively young kind of civilization. You could say that even throughout most of the early Middle Ages, Europe was a less developed, tribal kind of society made up of pre-feudal chieftainships, fiefdoms that were at war and with each other, but also at war with the remnants of the decaying Mediterranean civilization of the Roman Empire. And so, what you have with these river basins is you have stable strategies of cooperation between humans within human societies that allow a repurposing of the particularly fertile ground around the river and also the fertilization function that that river has. So as soon as humans coordinate in a way that could take control of the river to the extent that they could harness and redirect the river's energy to maximize fertility of the soil, it enabled a population explosion, and the soil often also allowed for the burning of bricks and the construction of housing, especially housing that was functional and potentially could house multiple people or larger families within one kind of building block. To my point about the bias we have towards the artifacts we discover about the past, I have a great quote here by Lewis Mumford, Technics and Development, The Myth of the Machine. Great book if you want to look at the history of, or you could say the prehistory of the Industrial Revolution, where he speaks of the rise of human technics and human technology going back to early ancient times. Quote, The burial of the dead, the creation of art, the invention of language, the development of myth and ritual, these were the real treasures of early culture. Not the stone axe or the digging stick, but because these leave no durable traces, our mechanical-minded archaeologists have ignored them, and our concept of early man has been distorted by our technological bias. So, in addition to that, I have another quote by David Graeber and Ian Wengrow in their work, The Dawn of Everything. Quote, If there's a single overriding lesson to be taken from the past 50 years of research in archaeology and related fields, it's that the picture of human history that most people are familiar with, the story that there was once a time when everyone lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers, that the invention of agriculture led to farming and the rise of cities, and that this in turn gave rise to civilization and finally something vaguely approximating the modern state, is simply wrong. It is not what happened. Human beings have lived in a bewildering variety of social arrangements, and crucially, many of these did not involve kings, states, bureaucracies, or organized violence. Yes, that is probably very true, that we've had many different kinds of cultures, a vast diversity of human strategies. However, there seems to have been a historical filter or a selection process. Just as we speak of evolutionary stable strategies in terms of the cooperation of mammals or other animals, we have the same situation with human societies. And as in evolution in general, we have a kind of selection process, one that can be pretty ruthless. We've had a historical selection process, one that in a way invalidates what Graeber says here, namely that we had the rise of these states that were led by a military king, a warrior king. We had those states dominate and progressively select out all of its competitors. Not all of them, but what has dominated history and what has dominated the kind of competition or the cohabitation of these various kinds of human coordination strategies, what has dominated that has been the rise of power structures. And that is what makes the whole study of power worthwhile in the first place, because otherwise there'd be not much to study here. Right. So the reason why it is pretty fascinating to look at early history in terms of the early Mesopotamians or Egyptians is because you have these different power systems, these different power networks, not yet separated as we have them today. So as I've just explained, that these power systems may not directly operate on each other. They may be structurally coupled, but not directly operating on each other. This was not the case in ancient Mesopotamia. This was not the case in ancient Sumer or Akkad. You actually had one and the same elite at the center. And that is an ongoing question about elite theory in general. So elite theory in general, especially going to the so-called Italian school of political theory, dominated by people like Perito or Mosca, or if you go back, the pioneer would have been definitely Machiavelli. If you look at what they have to say, is that any separation of powers is necessarily illusory. So it is a radical critique against Montesquieu or Tocqueville or Madison in the United States, any kind of proponents of the checks and balances, the separation of power, where the judicial power can be separated from legislative power, for example. Any system of that sort would necessarily be illusory. It would be performative. And especially in modern states, because in terms of the earlier states of classical antiquity that would express a similar kind of separation of powers, you would have at least a genuinely separate origin of their development. So, for example, in ancient Rome, the Senate was a genuinely separate entity to the tribunal. It was a genuine separate entity that developed separately. There was no written constitution that guaranteed the existence of both. There was no common foundation of both of them. There was no assembly that created both of them at once. Each of them developed with time and had informal relationships with each other. So the there was no clarity, there was no formal clarity for much of early Roman Republic on whether a certain decision, whether the Senate had a specific decision power, which it officially didn't have. It was an advisory board in a sense, or whether the tribunal had it, or whether certain other people in positions like the consuls or the censors, depending on their area of governance, had the power. So whilst elite theorists would argue that even then the separation of power was illusory, even then there was a kind of overarching power that crystallized and formalized itself with the rise of the empire, with the rise first of the triumvirate of Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompeius, and then with the establishment of the imperial throne. And you can see in the triumvirate, and you can see in those kind of warlords that were members of the triumvirate in ancient Rome, that there was already a kind of coordination across political separations. So while some of them were consuls at a time, and then in and out of consulship, others were tribunes at a time, and in and out of tribuneship, others were military commanders fighting in the provinces at time, all had different formal political positions, but their strategy, their political strategy of consolidating power did not change on the political sphere. Their objectives were being followed regardless of their position. And going back in history, you can see that separation that we have as an illusion, according to elite theorists, didn't even exist as an illusion. There was no separation. There was one elite that was the priesthood, but also the financial elite. The priests were initiated into the art of writing, but also accounting. They were dealing with all of the finances, with all of the currency exchanges, but also with the religious matters. So political power, ideological power, economic power were all in the hands of the priests. It is military power that split off first. It is military power that is the odd one out in this quaternity of four systems of power. So if you look at the later systems where we have separations of power, that's where we get into murky territory. That's where it becomes unclear whether we're looking at kind of one elite at a struggle replacing the other elites, whether the elites are kind of in a mutual bond where they need each other. They're kind of codependent for maintaining and sustaining their power. Or if there is a genuine conspiracy at play, if there is a genuine kind of long-term strategy of this kind of elite that began in ancient times, this kind of elite that is financial, ideological, political, and even military at once, but delegates tasks to certain external, exoteric power holders that people could follow, that people could worship, or people could resist against, revolt against, overthrow, and even execute. Whilst in the background, in the shadows, you have the same kind of priestly elite still in charge. This is, of course, a very conspiratorial view that's full of speculation, hard to confirm or deny. In many cases, unlikely. However, in order to understand the origins, the common origins of our vastly different power systems and our differentiated power networks as we have them now, it is useful to look at their original ancestors in the ancient and earliest societies that we know of. I've got a quote here from Michael Hudson, also a great author. I can basically recommend all of his work. He's also got some lectures online. Quote, "The solution was to designate grain and silver as the main monetary and debt-paying commodities. grain for the agrarian economy, and silver for the palatial economy that dominated foreign trade in its dealings with merchant entrepreneurs. This enabled balance sheets, monthly and annual statistics to be expressed in terms of dual common denominator, silver and grain. A quart of barley was set as equal in value to a shekel of silver, 8 grams. And this ratio was used to denominate fees and other payments owed to the large institutions. End quote. So essentially, what you have is you have the unity of power within the temples. You have the unity of power. Even the economic system in terms of silver wasn't really intended for use by the commoners. It wasn't really intended to be used as money as we know it today, as cash, for example. Most of it was kept as an accounting measure within the temples, was exchanged among the temples, and the actual payments by the commoners were made in barley. They were made in grain. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget this, at the same time these temples were run by the priests. So the priesthood wasn't only there for finances. The priesthood was also the only class that was initiated into writing. So you have the rise of an elite that was initiated fundamentally into a practice that most people were not capable of accessing. And in this sense, you have a secluded society that was capable of developing ideological power, developing rituals, developing religion in its earliest sense. I'm not talking about religion as we know it today in terms of churches, but religious rituals, religious scriptures, religious myths, religious practice, developed them to a much higher level, or a much more sophisticated and much more, you could say, opaque and occult level than it had been before. So whilst you had in tribal shamanistic societies, you had a kind of form of early mysteries where the tribe would engage in a kind of shamanistic reproduction, you could say, of a cosmic cycle, of a cosmic myth. That is something that Erich Neumann talks about, or Joseph Campbell, any of the major young Carl Gustav Jung scholars on his work on myth can be read to look into this, but also even further going into works such as that of Dan Trell, known as the Modern Hermeticist on YouTube, on also the works of James Frazer. That should always be a work to read into and look at, is the enormous magnum opus, The Golden Bough of James Frazer, where they speak of the kind of early animistic rites of religious practice in tribal society, where you had a shamanistic circle that would reenact myths, common myths that unite the group. And the group, the sense of unity of that group, that is something that is captured by common narrative. Any kind of idea about what we are, who is us, is captured by common narrative. We went through this, we lived through that. We were created through the union of the sun and the moon, through some kind of mythical narrative that is reproduced in a common ritual where everyone is part of the creation, where it partakes and participates in the ritual, and the shaman is merely the guide of that ritualistic journey, often accompanied, as Dan Trell expresses in his work Shamanism and the Mysteries, by the ritual use of psychoactive substances. For example, you had shamans consuming the Amanita muscaria, the toadstool mushrooms, as a classic stereotypical example of shamanistic use of psychoactive substances. So following from that, where you had these intense involvement of everyone, even a king, even a chief was involved in bringing about rain and sunshine, was involved in bringing about the change of seasons. The whole tribe was involved to some extent, even in a very aggressive and repressive capturing of kings, where Fraser speaks about how kings were subjugated into their role of having to always bring about the seasons. This kind of transformed once you had this separation of practices, once you had the emergence of this dominant strategy of exploiting the river basins. You required a highly coordinated society that was capable of coordinating using the sophisticated technology of written language that was only usable and applicable by a certain select elite. Once that separation was in place, you have a much more esoteric cult of worship, a split, you could say, an esoteric-exoteric split. There was an exoteric ritual, a sacrificial ritual, for example, that people partook in, whilst there was an esoteric initiation into the meaning of those mysteries, into the meaning of those practices. That was something that led to the initial rise of more complex society. Now, in my way of speaking, I say it led to the rise of power systems, of power structures in early history. That doesn't mean that there's a direct causal connection. I'm speaking here of a purely correlational relationship. So when looking at history, it's very difficult, and one should be very careful in making strong statements about causality. So what I will say is, perhaps more correctly, that the rise of power structures and more complex societies correlated or came alongside the separation, the initial separation of the esoteric and exoteric classes of society, the esoteric and the exoteric structure of rule and power. So this is a brief introduction into what I'll be talking about in the next episodes. I just wanted to get this live stream back on track, get it going again. And I will see you next time, back into a more regular practice of this show. I'll see you next week. And don't forget to check out my Substack and check out my courses and get my book on the philosophy of the machine.